Hey YouTube, D's here, and this is part 3 of my Gundam LED tutorial. So where we've left off is that we've soldered in our switch and our resistor, and we have our switch in place underneath the back skirt. Next is to get the battery into place and to feed the wires through the rest of the body. Alright, so thinking ahead a little bit, you're going to want to choose where you want the wires to go through to the head. A good place is the back of the neck. So I'm just going to drill 2 small holes using a very small drill bit, like a size 55 or around there. These holes will be just big enough for your wires to go through. And this is a very nice discrete spot where they won't be showing, because the back of the head will cover these up. Next, you're going to want to get the battery, and now it's time to get it into position. So choosing the wire with the resistor on it, you're just going to want to trim that to the size you're going to want. I'm choosing about 1 inch. This does not give me a lot of wire to work with. There's not a lot of slack, but yeah, that's the size I want. But if you want to leave yourself more slack, you can, and there should be plenty of room to tuck the wire into the chest if you need to. So I'm just gonna clip on with my helping hand so that I can work with it, and I'm just gonna pre-tin the wire. To do this, you just add wire to the exposed, or add solder to the exposed wires. And once you have done that, you're going to want to grab some copper tape and just add a big glob of solder to that copper tape. I have used other pieces of conductive metal in the past, but I think copper tape is the easiest to work with, so that's what I'm going to use to connect the wires to the battery. Alright, so once you get a big glob, you're just going to want to cut around it, and you're going to want to solder it to that wire. By pre-tinning it, it makes it a lot easier to stick it to that big glob of solder. So I'm just going to hold on to it with a pair of pliers and get it into position and just kind of heat it up, and then without moving it, so that there's time for the solder to cool down and harden back up so that the wire will stick in there. And just like that. So once you get that soldered into position, you're just going to want to trim around the tape so that the surface area isn't larger than the battery itself. And then you're just going to want to stick it to the battery. The thing with copper tape is that you want to compress it against the surface as flat as possible. It's like a thin piece of metal, so it'll bend and crinkle. So you want to press really firmly so that it'll stick and bend to the shape that you want it to be. And once you get that stuck on, you're going to want to create a negative battery lead. To do this, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. Just strip off some of the wire, pre-tin it, and then solder it to a big glob of solder that's on the copper tape. Pretty much the same thing you just did, except that it's a little easier to do it this way because it's not tethered to the rest of the Gundam. Okay, so once you get this all assembled, you're going to want to cut around the wire just the same way you did before. The only difference here is that you're going to want to cut not very small, but a much smaller surface area than the positive side. As this is because the negative side of the battery contact is much smaller, and you don't want it touching the positive side, so you want this to be smaller. And the trade-off is that it's not going to stick that well, but just press real hard and try to get it to stick as well as you can. And next you're going to want to wrap some electrical tape around the lengthwise so that these pieces of wire do not come undone. So you're just going to cut a piece of electrical tape, and you don't want it to be too wide, so I'm just going to trim it with my scissors, or you can cut it with your hobby knife just the way I did with the duct tape. And the trick for wrapping it around here is to pull it as tightly as you can. This will improve the contact of all the batteries and the leads. I noticed that there's been some contact issues. Alright, once you get the battery all hooked up, you're going to want to feed the wires through the holes you drilled in the back of the neck. And make sure you get all the poly caps in place, but before you close it up, you're going to want to test it. I didn't, and I had to reopen it up, which you'll see in a second, but yeah, I had closed it up, and what I did next was trim the excess wire off, because I don't need that much at all. And so to test it, what you're going to want to do is strip off some of the wire shielding, and using some test leads, you're going to want to clip on to those wires and connect like the positive wire to the positive leg of the LED, which is the longer one if you do not know, and the negative to the negative. Then once you flip the switch, you'll know either if it's working or if it's not. I actually was expecting it not to work because those contact issues with the battery. I haven't really figured out a good way to work around that, but yeah. And here I just kind of ripped off the switch because the super glue just ripped the paint off. So I ended up just leaving it unglued. So that's your own choice. But as you can see, I flipped the switch and there's no LED lighting up. So I have to reopen it and figure out what's wrong. And this is the point where I'm pretty glad that I drilled out those holes, because there's so many pieces in the chest that it's really difficult to pry open. So I figured out that by just pressing it lightly that the LED would turn on. So what I did to fix this was I just kind of wedged it between these two larger pegs like so, and that just created enough pressure to fix that problem. Yeah, again, like I haven't really figured out how to avoid that issue. It happens a lot when doing batteries like that. So I put it back together and finished assembling the outer armor and everything. So this is going to conclude part 3. So we're almost done. All that's left is to solder in the LED. So join me in part 4, where we will finish up this tutorial. So, and it's good to think ahead about how to assemble things. Like I wouldn't be able to slide that piece on if the head was in place, so it's good to think ahead at these kind of parts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.